Have you ever killed anyone? For most of you, and I hope all of you, the answer is probably no. Have you ever believed you might have the moral capacity to decide someone's life and death? Almost certainly, like everyone else. Because before every crime, every execution, every river of blood, there is a particular architecture of thought, a logic of monstrousness. And here's what makes it genuinely terrifying. It cannot be refuted, because the logic of monstrousness does not simply permit the worst things a human being is capable of. It encourages them, and it excuses them. In 1866, Fyodor Dostoievsky published one of his major novels, Crime and Punishment. Dostoievsky was 44 when he wrote this book. He was not writing from a comfortable desk, he was writing from debt, from financial desperation, from a life marked by imprisonment, by a Siberian labor camp, by epilepsy, by the deaths of people close to him. He knew from the inside what it meant to live at the margins, to feel the weight of the world pressing down on you with no way out. Dostoevsky does not describe poverty and isolation from the outside. He had lived them. The central character is named Rodion Raskolnikov. He is a 23-year-old student in St. Petersburg in the middle of summer. He has dropped out of university. He cannot afford the fees. He barely eats. He has almost no human contact. He spends his days walking through the city and thinking. And he is thinking about something specific. For months, Raskolnikov has been working on a theory about human beings, about power, about morality, a theory that, if correct, changes everything, that justifies the unjustifiable and transforms murder into a necessary act. Raskolnikov divides humanity into two categories. On one side, ordinary people, people born to reproduce the existing order, to follow the rules, to live within the limits society has drawn for them. Not bad. Just without their own vision. They exist inside history rather than making it. On the other side, extraordinary people. The ones who move history forward, who see what others cannot see, who have both the capacity and, according to Raskolnikov, the obligation to cross the lines that ordinary morality imposes on everyone else. He gives examples: Napoleon, Caesar, Muhammad, Newton, Lycurgus, men who changed the course of events and who, to do it, transgressed the laws of their time, who killed, conquered, overthrew without asking permission. And here is the central question that drives the entire theory. If Newton had needed to kill 100,000 people to give humanity his laws of gravity, would it have been worth it? Take a moment with that question. Newton's laws of gravity transformed humanity's understanding of the universe. They made possible centuries of physics, engineering, medicine, technology. Human capabilities expanded beyond anything previously imaginable. 100,000 deaths against billions of lives improved. The math holds. That is Raskolnikov's theory in its pure form. Not a call to random violence, a utilitarian calculation pushed to its logical extreme. If the benefit to humanity sufficiently outweighs the immediate cost, the cost is justified, and the man with the vision large enough to make that calculation correctly has not just the right to act, he has the obligation. It is to test this theory that Raskolnikov chooses a victim, an old moneylender named Alyona Ivanovna, a woman everyone in her building despises. She loans money to the poor at usurious rates. She mistreats her half-sister. She hoards while people starve in the streets of St. Petersburg. Raskolnikov does his calculation. The money hidden under her mattress could save dozens of families. She represents in his vision nothing more than a parasitic obstacle to the flow of resources. Killing her is not ordinary murder, it is an act of social hygiene, a necessary act carried out by a man with the moral clarity to recognize it as such. Raskolnikov had planned. He had thought through every detail, he had run the numbers, he was calm, he was certain. He enters Alyona Ivanovna's apartment. He kills her, and then something happens that his theory had not factored in. The moneylender's half-sister comes home, Lizaveta Ivanovna, a woman everyone in the neighborhood knows. She runs errands for the neighbors. She has no enemies, she was not in the calculation. She comes back, she sees what has happened, and Raskolnikov kills her too. The theory, in its abstract form, had factored in deaths, a reasonable number justified by the expected benefit, but the theory can never factor in all the variables of reality. What had been measured with certainty in advance became blurry at the point of execution. This is not a flaw specific to Raskolnikov, it is a structural limitation of every calculation of this kind. But that is not the most interesting part. What is more interesting is what happens next in Raskolnikov's body. He cannot stop shaking. His body refuses to accept what his mind has decided is acceptable. His hands behave like the hands of a murderer, not like the hands of a man who has performed a necessary act. In the days and weeks that follow, Raskolnikov does not feel liberated. He does not feel confirmed in his theory. He feels more alone than he has ever been in his life. Now, someone might object here. They might say, Raskolnikov simply was not strong enough, not extraordinary enough. A truly great man of vision, a Napoleon, a Caesar, would not have had these symptoms. He would have carried out the act and moved on. That is, in fact, exactly what Raskolnikov tells himself, that his trembling proves he was ordinary, that the theory remains true. But here's where history steps in and says something interesting. The great perpetrators of history did not shake. Napoleon had no panic attacks after his battles. Stalin slept. Hitler slept. The commandants of the camps did not have nightmares, at least not immediately. And the reason is very precise. They did not kill with their own hands. Raskolnikov's theory in its pure form assumes that the extraordinary man applies his vision directly, that he acts himself. But in the reality of power, it never works that way. The men who carry the great theory, the vision large enough to justify the deaths, systematically delegate the execution to others. It is the soldiers who shake, the guards who develop sleep disorders, the men sent to the front who come back with psychological wounds that were never counted in the original calculation. There is no war without PTSD, no massacre without broken soldiers, no great vision without an entire category of people asked to put their hands into something their bodies rejected. Because what the physical disorder of the executors reveals is something the theory had carefully avoided looking at. The disorder does not disappear because you delegate, it moves, it spreads through everyone who put their hands in the act, and it works its way back, sooner or later. And that is where something fundamental about the theory reveals itself. The theory is coherent. It is reality that refuses to comply with it. This is not a logical error inside the theory. It is something more radical. Reality, the human body, the uncalculated damage, the unplanned victims. Reality systematically refuses to bend to the precision of the calculation. Every single time, without exception in recorded history, the theory meets reality, and reality wins. Not because the theory was wrong in its premises, but because reality is more complex, more unpredictable, more human than any theory can capture. In many ways, the 20th century is the most thoroughly documented laboratory of Raskolnikov's theory. Never before had the men of vision had so many resources to put their vision into practice. Entire state apparatuses, millions of soldiers, industrial technologies of death, ideologies built over decades, carried by intellectuals, defended by philosophers. And every time, the pattern repeated itself with a regularity that should have stopped someone. There is always the vision, always magnificent in its formulation, a more just society, a purified civilization, a radiant future for generations to come, a nation reclaiming its greatness. The formulation changes, the structure is identical. There is always the obstacle, the people who resist, the classes that oppose, the enemies within who sabotage. The obstacle is always real in some sense. There is always something or someone standing between the vision and its realization. And there is always the calculation. The obstacle must be removed. The cost is regrettable but necessary. The long-term balance sheet is favorable. The man of vision has the responsibility to act where ordinary men will not. And every time, reality overflows the calculation. The collateral damage always exceeds the projections. The designated enemies multiply as paranoia grows. Yesterday's allies become today's obstacles. The vision itself deforms under the weight of what it required to impose it. There is a moment in almost every major project built on Raskolnikov's theory, a moment historians document. Biographers describe, trials reveal, where something shifts. It is the moment when the carrier of the theory, the man of vision, suddenly comes face to face with the concrete consequences of what he ordered. With faces, with bodies, with the gap between the theory as he held it in his mind. Clean, logical, necessary, and the reality of what it produced in the flesh of the world. And in most cases, not all, history shows exceptions, but in most documented cases something breaks. Not always publicly, sometimes only in private diaries, in unsent letters, in confessions wrung from the end of a life. But the breaking is there. Napoleon, who had moved through 20 years of war without seeming to waver, dictated his memoirs on St. Helena with the obsession of a man trying to convince someone, perhaps himself, that all of it had been worth it. The architects of the great ideological projects of the last century ended their lives, for the most part in states their theories would not have predicted: paranoia, isolation, total distrust of everyone around them, as if the theory once put into practice had begun to turn against its own carriers. This is not a coincidence, it is mechanical. A theory that justifies eliminating obstacles to the vision cannot stop at a fixed list of obstacles. They multiply as the vision advances. The logic of the theory, once set in motion, does not close itself off. Raskolnikov had no army to protect his theory from its own consequences. He only had his hands and his body said no before his conscience had time to. That may be the real answer to the theory, not a philosophical argument, not a logical proof. A body that shakes, hands that can no longer hold a fork, a fever that will not break. Reality does not refute the theory with a counter-argument. It refutes it with consequences, with everything the original calculation had failed to calculate. And the gap between what the carriers of the theory said, the grandeur of the vision, the necessity of the act, and and what they actually produced in the real world is, in almost every documented case, immense. Not because they were hypocrites. Most of them genuinely believed it, but because the world does not bend to theories, however coherent. It absorbs them, deforms them, and always eventually presents the bill for everything they failed to account for. Raskolnikov is not Stalin or Netanyahu. He has no army, no party, no state apparatus. He is a student in a small apartment who convinced himself, through a chain of reasoning that seemed perfectly logical, that he was exempt from the rules that applied to everyone else. That is the version of this theory that lives in each of us. The idea that in this specific case, with what you know that others don't, with the awareness you have of the situation, the ordinary rules don't quite apply in the same way. That the people who would be hurt by what you're about to do don't have the full picture. That if they could see what you see, they'd understand. Dostoievsky did not write this novel to condemn Raskolnikov. He wrote it to show you what this theory looks like when it meets reality. To let you watch the hands that won't stop shaking, the body that knows what the mind refuses to admit. Your conscience is not a social construction. It is not an arbitrary set of rules imposed by a culture you didn't choose. It is information. When it tells you that the calculation you're making is wrong, when something in your body says no before your mind has had time to answer, that is the most reliable signal you have. Raskolnikov spent months learning that. The men who carried the same theory at different scales, some never learned it at all. Some died still believing the calculation was correct, and that reality itself was simply wrong. But everyone who took this logic in, who acted on it, ended up paying sooner or later a price they never thought they would owe. You can read it in the accounts, in the paranoia of the final years, in the concentric circles of distrust that closed in around them until almost no one was left inside, in the isolation that the vision, fully applied, always seems to produce in its own carrier. The theory, the one that always presents itself as necessary, even noble, produces in its carrier, at its furthest point, nothing but a particular kind of solitude.